Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the early history of China in our continuing study of world civilizations. When we look at the ancient cultures of the world, we're struck by the fact that ancient civilizations began by large river systems, so that we have the Nile in Egypt, we have Mesopotamia and with the Tigris and Euphrates, we have the Indus River Valley, and we have China. And China, no less than the others, is influenced by two major river systems. The rivers that we're speaking of are the Yellow River in the north, the Yangtze in the south, and they both flow toward the east, which means that China was always facing east. Now, one of the early concepts you have is the yin and the yang, represented in the symbol by night and day, light and darkness, male and female, the hard and the soft. And these two rivers played into that same sort of dualistic look at the way nature was. So you have the Huanghe, that is the Yellow River, also described as China's sorrow because when it floods, it could be incredibly destructive. And then there was the Yangtze, which is the third longest river in the world after the Amazon and the Nile. And so these two river systems were going to shape China. They were going to make it, in a sense, two lands that are together. We sometimes talk about Egypt and the two lands there along the Nile, the upper and the lower. This is the north and the south, and yet they would eventually bind the country together. Now, there are some ancient myths regarding these two rivers. One myth said that the first man and woman were created from the mud of the Yellow River, and that a great flood came and settled them there. And the first dynasty is said to have been founded by the Yellow River. It was thought that this dynasty was really the stuff of myth and of legend. But then we've come to discover there were indeed roads and irrigation from this very early period. The founder of the dynasty, the legend has it that the local ruler gave up his position to his prime minister, Yu, and he founded the Xia Dynasty. This took place in an area called Xia, so hence the name. What is it legend? Is it history? Excavations in 1959 uncovered what seems to be ancient ruins from this dynasty. And so the Chinese historians today say, yes, there are legends, but they're rooted in history. Now, next we have the Shang Dynasty. For the Shang Dynasty, we actually have records that are kept on oracle bones. You're looking at a bone here with the very early marking. These are known as dragon bones. They would be taken even up until recent times and ground up into powder and used for various medicinal purposes. Whether they were really effective or not, that's anyone's guess. In the 19th century, apothecaries would grind them up and sell them as medical potions, and some of these were found to have writing upon them. And studies began to be made, and indeed, this writing could begin to be deciphered. And these were used to communicate with dead ancestors. So it was part of ancestor, I don't know if I want to call it worship, but sort of an idea of ancestor communication. In the Shang Dynasty, we begin to have writing developed. There's no alphabet. That makes it very difficult. You know, with English or Greek or Hebrew, you memorize 22 or 26 letters, and now you can write all sorts of things. Instead, we have the various parts of these dashes and lines that combine to make up ideas. So you have basic marks that are showing things like up and down or over or under, and the writing begins to be developed on bamboo and wood, but there are not just hundreds, there are thousands of symbols. Now we have, during this dynasty, notice this is from 1600 to to 1046 BC. You have kings in tombs that are buried with their family members and servants. And well, what happens if the king dies before the family member? Well, that's tough luck for them. They're going to go into that tomb. And the idea is possibly similar to what we'd seen in Egypt. The idea that the king wants to take all of his stuff, all of his people, all of his beloved ones with him into the next life. Now, this is the period of the Bronze Age in China. You have wars with nomads from the north, and so the need for bronze weaponry. You also have a planetary alignment in the year 1053 that was seen as a sign of heavenly displeasure, and this is going to be part of what brings the dynasty to an end. Was it self-fulfilled prophecy? I don't know. I wasn't there. But a revolt rose up now against the Shang Dynasty and brings this dynasty to an end. Next, we have the Zhou Dynasty. Notice from 1027 to 221 BC. This is going to be the longest of all of the dynasties of China, 800 years. This is going to see a sort of feudalism in China, with the land owned by the nobles and worked by the serfs, the very definition of feudalism. The emperor would have what was called the mandate of heaven, that the heavens, whoever's in charge up there, had mandated that the emperor be in charge, and as long as he's doing a good job, he would continue to have this mandate. It's also during this time that we have Sun Tzu writing his epic book, The Art of War, a book that is still studied in military academies even today. There are advances in religion, advances in philosophy, as this dynasty sees the rise of culture. It's Confucius that earmarks this dynasty. He's a philosopher, actually begins as a mid-level bureaucrat, known for his wisdom, and he resigns from his position to travel and see, well, that part of the world. He's not going to go to other sections, but still, remember, China is very, very large, and he comes back with this idea: if I can just learn how to rule myself, then everything else will sort of take care of itself. And so this idea of having the self-discipline to rule yourself, one of his comments, what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others, reminds us of the golden rule that Jesus gives: do unto others. Now notice, the words of Jesus are in a positive way. Do unto others what you would wish have done to you. What Confucius says much the same thing, but in the negative sense: what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. And now we also begin to have a competing idea known as Taoism. Sometimes you'll see it pronounced and even spelled Daoism, same way. Remember, not all the Chinese pronunciations and letters are going to match up to English. Not all their sounds are our sounds. So Taoism just means the way. These are the teachings of Lao Tzu. And like I said, the term means the way, and it is a call to live in harmony with nature. Happiness is found not in ruling yourself, but just in finding the balance of all things. That balance that we talked about, that is the very sort of essence of Chinese thinking. Live in moderation and in simplicity, with compassion, and then you will find happiness. The gods, or God or gods, whether it's multiple gods or a single god, they don't play a part in history. They're there, but they're doing their thing. We're doing our thing, and so just find a way to get along. A quote that comes from the founder: being divine, you will be at one with the Tao. Being at one with the Tao is eternal, and though the body dies, the Tao will never pass away. You're part of something bigger than you, so find satisfaction in knowing that that is the case. Now, we can see these two modes of thought, Confucianism and Taoism, in contrast to one another. Of course, Confucianism is the followers of Confucius. Tao, that's the followers of Lao Tzu. Um, Confucianism says it espouses a belief in one God. The ancestors are respected, we might even say worshipped. In Taoism, there is no personal God. It focuses upon the natural world and whatever brought that about. In Confucianism, the call is to have a structured society. If I can rule myself, then I can have some of that spill out into the rest of society. And Taoism is to be at one with the Tao to experience immortality. I don't really need society. Notice I can sort of divorce from society. In Confucianism, it's all about social harmony. In Taoism, it's about a balance in nature. In Confucianism, you can follow any religion and still follow the tenets of Confucius. In Taoism, all religions are said to be the manifestation of the Tao. Confucianism gives a focus on how to get along with society. In Taoism, it calls for a disconnect from society as I go to be at one with nature. In fact, society is almost considered the polar opposite. Um, Next, we look at the Qin Dynasty from 221 to 206 BC, going to be very short and yet will have a great impact. Founded by Qin Shi Huang. He's the one who first takes the title of the emperor. We've been using that term loosely prior, as there would be leaders and kings and so on, but he actually takes the title. Um, this dynasty is founded by warlords from northern China, and all conflicting books that conflict with his ideas and his rule are going to be burned. Now, fortunately, a number of books are taken and hidden away. It's during his dynasty that construction has begun, not completed, but it's begun on what will eventually be the Great Wall of China, this Great Wall stretching for 5,000 miles. You also have a earmark of his dynasty, that of legalism. That is the rule of law, that all things from the emperor on down are to be under the law, and all things are to be ruled thereby. We have discovered the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang in 1974, and it was filled with these terracotta warriors. Hundreds and thousands of warriors, each with its own facial expression. If you just look at the picture here, you notice, some of them look one way, some of them have their features present another way. One might have his head sort of tilted to the side. Mass produced, and yet with a great deal of individualism that is expressed. All the workers who built this mausoleum were killed so that its location could remain a secret. And this terracotta army was the closing manifestation of the power of this emperor who wanted to take his clay soldiers with him into the next life. Now, we mentioned legalism, and we want to explore that a bit more. This concept of law, the Chinese refer to it as fa, that there ought to be a system of being fair or just. And it says that people are basically evil. They'll generally act with a view toward their own self-interest. And so the law ought to be impartial, not giving credence to one because he is related to the judge, or credence to another because he has a higher position. That the law should be exercised by the state and not by an individual ruler, which sort of sets the ruler to do free to do his own thing. And that there will be this idea of legality and the state. And this becomes a portion of Chinese thinking, that a system of punishments, and it sets them forth, anywhere from branding to mutilation to amputation to castration, and of course, you would think execution is the worst, not necessarily considered the worst. Some of these others would be considered very dishonorable, and so you'd almost actually prefer to be executed as opposed to suffering some of these very dishonorable punishments. And remember, this was an honor and shame culture. Now, there's a difference here that's expressed between the Western mindset, here in the West, we're very individualistic in our thinking versus the collective mindset that each one of these different ideas, whether it was Confucius or Taoism or legalism, had a very collective mindset. It's all about, not about me individually, but it's about us collectively. Even Confucius, when he's talking about rule yourself, it's rule yourself in the context of society, not just rule yourself by yourself out doing your own thing. So two very different mindsets and different ways of thinking that continue in China and in the East, even to today, which is why really sometimes they look at us and don't really understand us, and we look at them and don't really understand them. Next, we have the Han Dynasty. We said the previous dynasty had been very short, but now we go from 202 BC to 220 AD. So this is a 200-year, I'm sorry, 400-year dynasty that will be in effect. And the Han had collected the writings of Confucius from the earlier age, but now are going to follow them. And so that educational requirements are required to hold public office. It's not, are you married or related to the boss, but rather there are going to be a series of tests. And we're going to see this overflow into a number of later dynasties too, that in order to hold public office, you have to pass this very stringent test. Yes, being able to read and write. Remember that it's not just a matter of knowing 26 letters and being able to put them together. Reading and writing involved a great deal of education because the Chinese language, involved as it was, the writing system was very, very, very involved and involved the memorization of thousands of characters. And so this means that only those highly educated people will be able to hold public office. Now that's open to the rich and the poor, but remember, it's going to be the wealthier people that have the facilities, the wherewithal to get their children educated to that level where they will be able to get that office. You also have during this period the invention of paper. Now that's not going to make it to the West, oh goodness, for almost 900 years. But the Chinese already have paper. You have Silk Roads that are opening trade to the West, that are taking supplies, and you say, well, why didn't paper make it to the West? Maybe they tried with some of it, but remember, it's got to go for thousands of miles through all sorts of temperature and climatic changes, and paper doesn't do well in wet atmospheres. So it may not have made it, or perhaps it was considered, well, that's nice, but far too expensive for us to transport it. We have other ways of dealing with that. Remember, at this time in Egypt, they were doing papyri, and in other parts of Europe, they were doing parchment, that is animal skin. But you have trade opened up that's bringing supplies, that's bringing silks, for example, all the way to Rome. Confucianism is now dominant during the Han Dynasty, and a new religion, Buddhism, will be introduced from India. Now, Confucian and Buddhism, again, can be seen in contrast one to another. Confucianism had originated in China. It was homegrown. Buddhism is a transplant from India. In the case of Confucianism, it involves ancestor worship, or at least a high respect, but I would go along with worship. A respect of superiors, like whether it's the ruler or the father or the husband or the elders. The goal is to gain social harmony and to act in morally correct ways. Hence we brought in that whole idea of legalism and the laws that tell you how you are to act. Now, with Buddhism, instead of ancestor worship, there's this idea of reincarnation where I die in one form and then I come back to life in some other form. And if I have been exceptionally good, then it might be a higher form. I can get better and better. Or if I have not behaved myself, it might be a lesser form. That is, instead of being a human, I might be a dog or a caterpillar. And so this is the idea of karma, that what goes around comes around, and I get back what I deserve. And these two ideas are sort of joined at the hip. Buddha taught that suffering is a part of life. You're just going to have to grin and bear it. That material possessions are bad, so it's better if I can release the material, that I can go and embrace the spiritual, and then maybe I can be reincarnated into a better form, which will be better and better. And the overcoming of the suffering that we talked about is can be attained by following an eightfold path. The Han Dynasty will come to an end with the collapse of China amidst competing houses, and everything falls apart. This introduces an era of disunity where there will not be one dynasty, but a bunch of different competing families. And so we'll come back and we'll look at China again after that period. We'll see that period again. But this brings to an end our study of China. But in closing, I want to notice something, that it's around this time, maybe a bit later. And we have the Roman Empire also going through a period of disunity. So we have the Roman Empire that had had a high degree of government stability. Likewise, the Han Dynasty had had a high degree of government stability. The Roman Empire brought to an end beginning in the 200s, but then going into the 3 and 400s with Germanic invaders from the north just coming in, and things got just very disorganized. Likewise, the Han Dynasty has steppe nomads coming down from the north. With the Roman Empire, the empire was divided into east and west with competing kingdoms. In the west, it sort of went back and forth, and now you go into a long period of disunity. And likewise, the Han Dynasty, the empire is splintered into these competing kingdoms. And so it's interesting to compare and contrast that as these were happening in one part of the world, at the other end of the world, some similar things were beginning to take place.